For centuries, the Christian faith survived in fragments, scattered across distant communities, sustained by texts copied by hand and passed on far from power. That changed when the faith ceased to be persecuted and began to be organized. In the 4th century, decisions began to be made, not about personal belief, but about historical permanence. Which texts would continue to be read, which ideas would be allowed to move forward, and which words would have to disappear for a single form to be maintained. These choices were not confined to imperial centers. They advanced in silence. They reached the deserts, the isolated monasteries, the men who still copied books as one preserves something living. Some understood before all others. In the south of Egypt, ancient codices were gathered in haste. Books used by entire communities were sealed in ceramic jars and taken to a remote cliff. The earth became shelter, time, protection. There those words remained buried for more than 1,000 years. In 1945, a farmer struck ancient pottery while digging the ground. What he found was not material wealth, but texts that had been removed from visible history. The presence of these texts is the result of a conscious choice. Someone decided to take them beyond the reach of their own time so that they might pass through the centuries. And when fragments return after centuries of silence, the question ceases to be what was preserved. It becomes what had to be removed. It is from this point of rupture that this story begins, in the Valley of Redemption. The Egyptian desert appears motionless, yet it watches. For centuries, it kept beneath its sands something that could no longer remain exposed. In December 1945, near the city of Nag Hammadi, Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging the dry soil in search of fertilizer. The earth was hard, the work repetitive, the silence absolute. With one strike, the tool met resistance. Ancient pottery, a large jar, sealed, intact. Muhammad hesitated. Local stories spoke of forces trapped inside buried vessels, but necessity spoke louder. The seal was broken. Inside the jar were books. 13 leather-bound codices, papyrus pages darkened by time, written in Coptic, the language of the earliest Christians of Egypt. They were not there by chance. Every detail suggested intention, care, urgency. Muhammad could not understand the words, but he sensed the weight of what he had found. He took the books home. Some pages were lost to the household fire. Others followed a different path. Through intermediaries, they reached scholars. When the texts were read, the silence changed its form. Gospels unknown to the modern world. Accounts attributed to the earliest centuries of Christianity. Writings that had been debated, opposed, and then pushed out of visible history. The desert had preserved something that historical time had tried to erase, and in that moment, it became clear that the jars did not hold books alone. They held the trace of a decision made long before, the decision to hide words so that they would not disappear forever. When the Nag Hammadi codices began to be translated, it became clear that they were not a single isolated text. They were different voices, traditions preserved in parallel, communities that had followed their own paths in the earliest centuries of Christianity. There were gospels attributed to familiar names, theological treatises, accounts of teachings passed on outside the central structures, texts that circulated among early Christian groups as legitimate reading, used for instruction, reflection, and worship. Nothing suggested improvisation. These writings belong to an organized spiritual world, still in the process of formation. One of these texts drew immediate attention: the Gospel of Thomas. There was no continuous narrative, no miracles or dramatic scenes. The book gathered sayings attributed to Jesus, presented as direct teachings, intended for those willing to understand them. Many of these sayings appeared in forms similar to the familiar Gospels. Others followed different paths, pointing towards a more inward understanding of the spiritual experience. Other codices deepened this diversity. Texts spoke of knowledge, of inner transformation, of direct access to the divine without rigid mediation. Spiritual authority emerged from understanding, not from an occupied position. For the communities that read these texts, faith did not depend on a solid hierarchy, but on a personal journey. This collection explained why those books had been set apart from the rest of the visible tradition. They preserved a less centralized Christianity, still plural, prior to the consolidation of a single doctrine. A Christianity in motion, where questions remained open and interpretations coexisted. The Nag Hammadi Codices did not present improvised heresies. They presented paths that ceased to be permitted when unity came to be treated as a political and religious necessity. And that was precisely what made those texts too dangerous to remain in view. As Christianity expanded, its diversity began to generate tension. Distant communities shared the same name, but not the same understanding. Different texts circulated, interpretations coexisted, authority emerged in different ways. The movement grew, but without a defined center. By the 4th century, this multiplicity came to be seen as a problem. The Roman Empire was passing through political instability and required cohesion. The Christian faith, now tolerated and protected, offered an unprecedented opportunity for symbolic unification. To achieve this, variations would have to be reduced. Religious leaders began to gather in order to define boundaries. It was not only a matter of faith, but of form, continuity, permanence. Doctrines began to be aligned, interpretations gained official weight, and texts started to be measured by how well they sustained a common structure. What favored centralization found shelter. What preserved parallel paths lost ground. This reorganization left real marks. Books ceased to be copied. Communities lost their points of reference. Entire traditions were removed from public reading and pushed to the margins of Christian practice. What had once circulated aloud came to exist only in the memory of a few. Unity began to consolidate itself as an ideal, and around it, a silent field took shape where certain words no longer had a place. As the 4th century advanced, Christianity ceased to be merely a shared faith and began to assume a defined form. To function within a vast empire, it required clear contours, recognizable doctrine, stable texts, identifiable authority. Councils were convened, Decisions began to be taken collectively. Interpretations gained official status. The faith started to be organized in order to endure, to teach, and to expand without visible fractures. In this process, texts were also assessed. Some fitted this emerging structure and came to be copied frequently. Others carried visions that kept plurality too alive for a system seeking cohesion. These ceased to circulate. The impact was gradual, yet profound. Books disappeared from public readings. Communities lost ancient points of reference. Traditions that had coexisted for decades were pushed into silence. Even so, not everything was absorbed by the new form. Some texts escaped because someone chose to preserve them beyond the immediate reach of power. They were hidden, buried, protected by distance and by time. When this structure finally consolidated, spiritual history no longer followed every path that had once existed. It followed those that had been chosen to remain visible. This story is not about the birth of a faith, but about how it was organized over time. Texts circulated, others ceased to circulate, and certain decisions defined what would remain visible to later generations. The manuscripts buried in the desert do not exist to replace the familiar texts. They show that early Christianity was broader, with different paths coexisting before a single form was established. What remained went on to shape centuries of belief and practice. What was silenced continued to exist only as fragment. The central issue is not to choose a side, but to recognize that the spiritual history of humanity was built through real choices made within specific contexts. The jars of the desert remind us that what we know is part of a larger picture, and that understanding this picture requires attention both to what was preserved and to what was left out of sight.